Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography, and today I'm talking about the 2011 superhero movie, Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance. Or as Idris Elba calls it in the movie,
The Spirit of Vengeance.
So in Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance, Nick Cage is back as Johnny Blaze, the former stuntman turned devil's bounty hunter. And since we last saw him, he's been hiding out and suppressing the Ghost Rider spirit inside of him. That is until Idris Elba, who represents an ancient church, tells Johnny Blaze that a child is in danger. And he tells him that if he brings the kid to the church, then his curse will be reversed. But to make matters worse, the demon lord Mephisto is after the kid too. Sorry, I couldn't make that last part rhyme. Now this movie is the sequel to the 2007 Ghost Rider movie, and I've already talked about that movie on my channel. To quickly give my opinion on it, I thought that Ghost Rider 1 had some cool elements and ideas, but none of them really came together in a satisfying way, and I found it a mostly underwhelming movie. But while the general consensus for that movie was kind of similar to mine and that a lot of people found it mediocre, the overall consensus for the sequel is that it's far worse than even the first movie. Like here on Wikipedia, it says that one person who watched the movie said that the sequel makes the first film look like The Dark Knight in comparison. And this guy I found on Reddit said, and I quote, "I enjoy the first one, but the second one was absolute booty cheeks." So I thought for this video, let's methodically test out the hypothesis that Ghost Rider: Spirit of Vengeance is absolute booty cheeks in comparison to the first one. So I devised 8 criteria in which I will evaluate and compare the two Ghost Rider movies, with the main emphasis of the discussion being directed towards Spirit of Vengeance, since I have already made a whole video talking about the first one, and you can hear me elaborate on some of my points more in that video. So let's start with our first category, the story. I called Spirit of Vengeance a sequel earlier, but executive producer E. Bennett Walsh said that it's definitely not a sequel, it's a totally fresh start. And co-director Brian Taylor said it's more of a requel, where we can abandon everything from the first movie except for Nick. There's no continuity. And I think in some ways that's a wise move, because they're going in such a different direction, it makes sense for them to distance themselves from the first one. But it is a little bit of a shock to the system when the movie starts up and we've got priests and Idris Elba with a French accent talking to Giles from Buffy, and they're running around a castle in Eastern Europe. I was a bit like, am I watching the right movie? And there are multiple noticeable changes in continuity, including Johnny Blaze's accent now just being Nicolas Cage's regular voice. He's lost his southern drawl from the first one. But I've also seen several Nicolas Cage movies where his accent changes within the same movie, so that didn't really bother me. Also, in the 2007 movie, they made a big deal out of how he can't transform into the Ghost Rider in the daytime. But in this movie, we see the Ghost Rider riding around in the daylight. But there is a part where the kid with demon powers reignites Johnny Blaze's Ghost Rider powers, so maybe that explains that. But I think the biggest change in continuity is the treatment of the character Mephisto from the first one. Here he's now called Rourke, and they act like he was always called that. He's also now played by Kieran Hines instead of Peter Fonda, which I think is fine. It makes sense that this all-powerful devilish being goes through several mortal forms. And apparently Peter Fonda was offered to reprise his role, but he turned it down after reading 5 pages of the script. But what I don't like is that the movie goes out of its way with a flashback to go, hey look, when Johnny Blaze made his pact, it was with Kieran Hines. No movie, you can't gaslight me. I remember it being Peter Fonda. Apparently the way the initial idea for the story of Spirit of Vengeance came about was that Nicolas Cage was in England doing press for Ghost Rider 1, and on his lunch break he wandered into Westminster Abbey and a bishop approached Cage and said, "You know, the church could use someone like you," which gave Nick Cage the idea for Ghost Rider teaming up with monks in Europe, which he then pitched to the producers. And the concept of a guy who made a deal with the devil now working with the church is a cool idea for a movie. I just don't think it's utilized very well here. My problem is it doesn't really feel like a movie about Ghost Rider teaming up with the church. He is begrudgingly acting on behalf of a group of monks, but he doesn't really interact with them all that much. He does sporadically meet up with Idris Elba's character, who's a member of this mysterious religious organization that we barely know anything about. But I kept forgetting that his character was even a monk. As far as I could glean from my research, David S. Goyer, who has writing credits on several comic book movies in varying degrees of quality, wrote the original script of this movie. That script then got punched up up by guys who worked on the show Flash Forward, which having watched that show is a bit of a red flag. And then the Crank Boys, Neville, Dean and Taylor got their hands on the script, which they said had a lot of story going on in that it was complicated and they compared it to The Lord of the Rings. So they trimmed it down and crankified it, and the end result is a very thin A to B to C type storyline. It's the kind of story that largely boils down to characters going, let's go here, now go here, now here's the fight, now go here. And also the movie really peters out in the last scene. I would have liked more of an epilogue showing us where the characters are gonna end up, but this movie hits us with a corny joke and then boom, end credits. But there is one element to the story that I kinda liked, and that's the Nick Cage protecting a young boy angle of the movie. The trope of the stoic guy thrust into taking care of a young kid is something we've all seen a lot of. I mean, Pedro Pascal has made a whole goddamn career out of those kind of roles. But specifically, it made me think of Terminator 2, especially with Johnny Blaze's interactions with the kid. And I quite like the moment with them bonding on the motorbike together. And there's a pretty fun part where the kid asks him this.
Whatever he rides changes with him.
And what if we took a taxi?
I don't know. I don't know.
Or a roller coaster, or a ski lift, or a camel, or a...
Dude.
Okay, now all I want to see is Nicolas Cage riding a flaming camel. But yeah, to me, these kind of scenes, while a little bit undercooked, felt like the heart of the movie. And I thought it was one of the only things to emotionally latch onto in terms of the story. But as for the story in the 2007 movie, that movie follows a very standard origin story structure. It was a product of Mark Steven Johnson, who was the writer and director of the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. And the story structure does feel like a lot of those mid-2000s pre-MCU Marvel movies. Now, I don't think that the story in the first Ghost Rider movie is particularly good. There's a lot of subplots I could have done without. There's clunky exposition, bad jokes, and cliches. But there's two aspects of that first movie that I've got to give the movie credit for. Firstly, the movie is an adaptation of the Ghost Rider comic book, and having read Johnny Blaze's first comic appearance, I think that the writer of the movie did quite a good job at streamlining the origin story and tweaking the parts that didn't make sense. I went into greater detail about this in my review of the first movie, but trust me, if they did a one-to-one conversion of that comic, I think a lot of people would be scratching their heads at some of the choices. So kudos to the way the first movie storyline handled that. And as far as I can tell, and I could be wrong, but I don't think Spirit of Vengeance is directly based on any comic book storyline. But secondly, the story of the first movie is much more thematically cohesive than Spirit of Vengeance. You could tell that the pitch for that movie was that they were going for an Easy Rider / Evil Knievel meets the Old West kind of a vibe. And the way they blended that together was pretty cool and effective for the most part. Whereas the story for Spirit of Vengeance doesn't really have as much of an identity or many tangible themes, other than here's a bunch of stuff that the directors thought was cool. So even though the stories in both movies are kinda subpar, I'll give this round to the first Ghost Rider movie because at least they put a bit of effort into telling a story. Next category is the pacing. Now, I know that pacing kind of falls under the story category, and it's not even something that I would usually highlight. And also, I think it's probably the most subjective criteria on the list. You know, one man's boring is another man's slow burn. But the pacing is something I wanted to specifically talk about here, because one of the most common criticisms of Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance is that it's slow. I've seen that crop up in a lot of reviews, and I really didn't feel that while watching this movie. This film is 1 hour and 35 minutes, and to me the runtime flew by. I think it's because, as I said, the story is very thin, and because they skimped on the story, the movie was then able to breeze by at a brisk pace. There's one or two sections of the movie that I thought meandered a little bit, but I thought every time that happened, the movie would then do something crazy or weird that would reignite my interest. And also, because the movie is a requel / fresh start, it's able to hit the ground running, outside of a little bit of animated voiceover exposition. Whereas the first movie had the harder job because it had to introduce all these concepts and characters to us first. And as a result, I think that movie heavily drags. Now, full disclosure, I've only ever seen the extended cut of the 2007 movie. And maybe in retrospect for this comparison, I probably should have watched the theatrical cut, so my bad. But in the version I watched, you've got pretty boring scenes at the start with a young Johnny Blaze. And we don't see Nicolas Cage until 20 minutes in. And we don't see the titular Ghost Rider until 50 minutes in. Whereas in Spirit of Vengeance, the Ghost Rider shows up 15 minutes in, which is quite the difference. And I don't want to come across as the kind of guy who can't watch a movie that takes its time to set up the plot. But the problem is, even though I just gave kudos to the story in the first movie in comparison to Spirit of Vengeance, the 2007 movie's story is really not all that compelling. There's tons of incredibly dull parts, aka whenever Sam Elliott isn't on screen and Nicolas Cage isn't eating a jelly bean. So even though this category should probably be called the How Long is a Piece of String section, I'm gonna give the point to Spirit of Vengeance because the first movie bored me and Spirit of Vengeance did not. Next up is the direction. As I said earlier, this movie was directed by Neville Dean and Taylor. They're mainly known for the Crank movies and their balls-to-the-wall, high-octane directing style. They were brought in because, as Neville Dean and Taylor said, Sony were looking for something more edgy, dark, and insane for the sequel, and they fit the bill. My personal theory is that some executive was watching Crank 2 and they got to the part at the end where Jason Statham is running around with his head on fire, and some producer said, hang on, we've got a project in the works about a guy with a flaming head. Hire these guys. And their style is all over Spirit of Vengeance. There's frequent use of shaky cam and cartoonish zooms. There's a trippy monochromatic thing, which the first movie also did very briefly, but I liked it better here. And they also seem to really like doing an overhead bird's eye view kind of a shot. They do that a lot. And as goofy and in your face as all that stuff can be, I think it's effective here. I think it adds a frantic, visceral tone. And I personally appreciate the stylistic visual flair. I also deeply respect all the practical stunt work that went into the making of the movie. There's also several moments that I assume weren't in the David S. Goyer script or the punch-up from the Flash Forward guys, because they feel very Neville Dean and Taylor to me, for better or for worse. Like this really weird cutaway with Idris Elba in a tree with the French national anthem playing. There's also a weird bit about Jerry Springer being the devil, which is accurate, but it also feels a little bit out of place. But there's also this part that to me has Neville Dean and Taylor's sense of humor written all over it. And that's the part where we see the Ghost Rider piss fire out of his dick. I mean, how can you call this movie booty cheeks when it's got stuff like that? And if you'll excuse me, I need to cross something off of my list of things that I want to see Nicolas Cage do. Okay, let's see. Oh, here we go. Now, the 2007 movie really doesn't go for any especially flashy moments in terms of the direction. There's not really any quirky camera work or crazy editing techniques. It's just a fairly standard looking movie, which is fine for what it is. I obviously don't want everybody trying to make their movie look like Crank 2 High Voltage. There are a handful of impressive shots in the first one. Like this part with Sam Elliott and Nick Cage riding together is a work of art that belongs in the Louvre. And there's a couple of instances of symbolic flourishes that I liked, but nothing else really stands out. Now, when comparing the direction, I understand that a lot of people weren't fully on board for the crankification of Ghost Rider and all of those crazy techniques. But as somebody who's a big fan of Neville Dean and Taylor movies, I really like what they brought to the table here, so point goes to Spirit of Vengeance. Alright, now for a little less conversation and a little more action, please. Spirit of Vengeance kicks off with a pretty cool shootout car chase sequence with Idris Elba, but I will say that Ghost Rider's first appearance and preceding fight scene in the movie is a little bit underwhelming. He just kind of awkwardly stands around at first. Then again, his first appearance in the 2007 movie was kind of lame too, where he comically gets his ass handed to him. But outside of that initial scene, the Ghost Rider has plenty of cool moments in Spirit of Vengeance. There's loads of cool parts with the chains. There's a bit where he literally eats bullets and spews them back at a guy, which is another one of those things that I can see somebody finding goofy, but I got a kick out of it. There's also this fun spin attack thing that he does that's like a special move in a video game. But the most badass part of this movie, hands down, is when he climbs up on this giant industrial excavator thing. And then it goes on fire and he uses it to smack the shit out of all of the goons, which is goddamn awesome. I absolutely love this sequence. The climax of the movie is pretty cool too. It's a big car chase with a flaming truck and we get a fight on top of a moving vehicle. It is a little bit unfortunate though, because as much as I like this final action sequence, it is a step down from the part with the big machinery thing which happened like 40 minutes prior. But I think the only way you could have really topped that is with a flaming roller coaster or a ski lift or a camel. Now as for the action in the first movie, like I said, it takes a while for the Ghost Rider to really do anything of note. I did really like the part with the motorbike going along the side of the building, that was cool. And the part where he swings around the helicopter was fun. But to me, those are the only action moments that really stand out. And the parts where he fights those elemental enemies were really lame. And I was also really let down by the final action sequence with all those Dementor looking things flying around. So I'm gonna give the point to the movie where the Ghost Rider ignites a giant mining machine. Next up is the visual effects. So let's take a look at both depictions of the Ghost Rider side by side. And as you can clearly see, the one on the left looks bad and the one on the right looks awesome. Okay, next category I'm going to be talking about. Alright, I probably should elaborate a little bit more than that. I love the character design for Ghost Rider in Spirit of Vengeance. I really like that they committed to the fiery, scalded quality of his look with the burnt skull and the singed jacket with the melted leather. This looks like a badass, hellish, demonic being. Whereas the 2007 Ghost Rider just looks kind of awkward. I mean, I've seen worse CGI, but there's something about the head that just doesn't look right. And it actually starts to look worse the longer you look directly at it. Talk about a penance stare. As for the rest of the CGI, I think it's mostly quite good in Spirit of Vengeance, apart from a couple of iffy moments. Whereas there's a lot of iffy instances of CGI in the first one, and only a handful of parts I thought actually looked good visually. And you could argue that this is an unfair comparison because Spirit of Vengeance came out 4 years later and technology had progressed by then. But Spirit of Vengeance was also way cheaper to make than the first movie, and it cost roughly half of what that movie did. So this one's a no-brainer to me. Spirit of Vengeance wins the CGI category by a landslide. And now for what's probably the most important category in these here parts, and that's Nicolas Cage's portrayal of Johnny Blaze. I criticized Nicolas Cage's performance in the first movie because I thought he severely underplayed the role in that film. Especially during scenes where something crazy was happening and his character looked like he barely was fazed by anything going on. But thankfully, Nicolas Cage gets to show off a lot more facets of his acting skills in Spirit of Vengeance. It's a much more dynamic performance, I think. He's a bit more aggressive and a lot less passive than in the first movie. I liked how twitchy he played it. He feels like a guy going through withdrawal symptoms, which in a way he kinda is because Johnny Blaze has been suppressing the Ghost Rider for so long. And we also get a lot of the staples of an entertaining Nicolas Cage performance, like quirky line deliveries.
You're the devil's baby, Mama. I guess that explains why Moreau wants Danny so bad.
We also get that classic Nick Cage wheezy laugh.
I'm gonna let him out.
And of course there's some great Nick Cage crazy faces. And the first movie had that one part with Cage making funny faces, but I prefer the freaky faces in the second one. I mean, there's a reason why it's the first thing you see in my intro theme song. But hands down, the best Nicolas Cage moment in the movie is when Johnny Blaze's character is interrogating a guy, and he's threatening the guy with transforming into the Ghost Rider, and he's fighting the urge to go full Jekyll Hyde, and as a result we get some great Nicolas Cage freakouts.
You're a bad man. And this thing, the Rider, he feeds on Batman and he's hungry. He's hungrier than he's been in years, and that's why I'm shaking. He's scraping at the door. Scraping at the door! You will tell me, why would he just think it's so good?
Have you figured out yet that Spirit of Vengeance is gonna win this category? There's not many dramatic character moments here, but there is a moment where he admits that it was kind of selfish to prolong his father's life just for his own sake. And there's also a whole thing about how the spirit Zarathos that's inside the Ghost Rider used to be an angel, and I think they tried to tie that into his redemption arc. And it feels a little bit forced, but at least it's an attempt at a character arc. And the first movie's character arc involved Johnny Blaze vowing to stay on as the Ghost Rider so nobody else would make deals with the devil, and that he'll keep on using his powers to protect people, which is somewhat dampened now because his whole thing in the second movie is that he wants to break the curse. So while the character of Johnny Blaze is not written very well in either movie, one of the movies has the common courtesy to remember the golden rule. When Nicolas Cage is in a movie, you should allow him to act batshit crazy. So in the battle of the Nicolas Cages and the Johnny Blazes, Spirit of Vengeance takes the cake. Now for the supporting cast. I mentioned Idris Elba's character earlier. He's this French alcoholic religious acolyte of some sort. And Idris Elba is quite entertaining here. Whenever he shows up, it injects a certain energy into the movie.
Johnny Blaze.
We really don't know much about his character, and his personality seems to just consist of a bunch of French stereotypes.
What a waste of good wine. Mad.
But Idris Elba is having fun, and that's infectious. I think the closest counterpart from the 2007 movie to his character was Sam Elliott, in that they both serve as somewhat of an advisor to Johnny Blaze. And Idris Elba is no Sam Elliott, but then again, who is? And I did like how Sam Elliott's character was intertwined with the lore of the Ghost Rider. But counterpoint, Idris Elba's character is actually involved in a pivotal fight scene in the third act. Unlike Sam Elliott, who just faded away right when it seemed like he was about to do something cool. And yeah, in case you're wondering, I'm still not over how pissed off that made me. I've also already mentioned the kid. He's the son of the devil and the possible future Antichrist. And I thought the kid playing him was a fine actor for his age. And as I said, I enjoyed his interactions with Nick Cage. But I just wish there was a little bit more of that in the movie. The devil's baby mama in the movie is somewhat of an interesting character. I thought it was a nice parallel to Johnny Blaze that she also made a deal with the devil. She got a half-demon son out of it. Johnny Blaze got a flaming skull head. I'm not really sure who got the better deal. She's not an amazing character, and I don't think the actress is especially remarkable. But I like that her character was in on the action some of the time. She's not made to be a damsel in distress. They don't force a love story with her and Johnny Blaze, and we even have a bit of backstory for her. I also think that she's a much more interesting character than Eva Mendes in the first one, who was completely dull and had no chemistry with Nick Cage. I also feel obligated to mention that Highlander star Christopher Lambert is in this movie as a bald tattooed monk for some reason. Apparently Christopher Lambert underwent 3 months of sword training and shaved his head for this role, even though he's only in this movie for a handful of minutes, which is kind of a shame. He could have made for a cool villain, but they introduce him and then unintroduce him way too quickly. But for the drunk Frenchman, the better written female character, and the likable kid, I'm gonna give the round to Spirit of Vengeance. Now for the final category, the villains. And yeah, I know that villains are part of the supporting cast, but I have a very important reason as to why I split them up. And that's of course because 8 categories is a nicer number than 7. But what's interesting here is that we can compare the 2 portrayals of Mephisto, or Rourke, or whatever he's calling himself these days. I will say that Kieran Hines undoubtedly lacks the coolness of Peter Fonda, but he does look pretty creepy here with his increasingly deformed looking face, until the movie goes a notch too far and his face looks way too goofy looking to take seriously. But I like that he has way more screen time than Peter Fonda, who was really underused, and it's cool that in Spirit of Vengeance he's more directly involved in the plot. But the villain who's in the thick of the action the most is a guy called Carrigan, who's a gun-running, drug-dealing mercenary. This guy has some really cheesy lines and a questionable delivery at times. But what I liked is that the actor really has an old-school 70s and 80s vibe about him. And in fact, I thought he kinda looked like a young Kurt Russell. Whereas one of my biggest criticisms of the first movie was that the Edward from Twilight-looking villain Blackheart felt so out of place with the rest of the movie. And halfway through Spirit of Vengeance, the Kurt Russell-looking guy gets given powers by Rourke, and now he kind of looks like Angelina Jolie in Gone in 60 Seconds. But actually, the character becomes way cooler because now he can make things decay by touching them, which is pretty badass. And also there's a gag where the only thing unaffected by his decaying powers is a Twinkie, which actually made me laugh out loud. And also the first movie had those stupid looking Earth, Wind and Fire henchmen, but those guys sucked. So for a devil character who doesn't just show up at the start and the very end of the movie, and for a villain who isn't this guy, I'm gonna give the round to Spirit of Vengeance. So let's tally up the results and find out who won. And the scores are 2007 movie 1, Spirit of Vengeance 7. So there you have it, actual factual evidence that it's in fact the 2007 Ghost Rider movie that's booty cheeks in comparison to Spirit of Vengeance. Okay, it's not really proof obviously, it's just my opinion, and I'm aware that I'm firmly in the minority here. But I wanted to break down for you guys why I like Spirit of Vengeance better. And I do get why people don't like it. I know it's not high art. The editing and the camera work is not for everybody. It's loud and it's dumb and it's insubstantial and it's very much lacking in the story and script department. But to me, that first Ghost Rider movie is largely uninteresting and full of missed opportunities, whereas Spirit of Vengeance is fun. It's dumb, fun entertainment with some cool visuals, fun action, and some dynamite Nicolas Cage moments. And at the very least, thank God it's not another generic thriller. So the next movie Nicolas Cage did was Stolen, which is apparently a generic thriller. Great. So until then, thanks for watching.